I would like to welcome on Charan Bashir. He is a mental health professional, very experienced in his field, and I'm just talking to him today. Pleasure to have you on.
Glad to be here, Michael. Glad to be here.
So, what would you say interested you in the field of psychology?
Well, for me, it's interesting. I never would have said that I had my sights on being a therapist or working within the field of psychology. I just always took a look at what felt pretty valuable and genuine to me. Much like the discussion that we had prior, you really enjoyed this relationship that you had with someone really special in your life. And for me, I really have always enjoyed developing relationship with people, getting to know people a little bit more, and also stepping into a mentorship or leadership role if I have the opportunity to. And by doing that, I just begin to consistently find opportunities where I would connect with people, whether it was volunteering in my community or volunteering even in my high school, right, with some really cool initiatives. One of which that comes to mind, Operation Snowball, this really phenomenal program just focused around empowering teens to make some really healthy and independent decisions within their lives.
Mhm.
And it really wasn't until I was in college where I studied psychology a little bit more and discovered I can make something that was a passion of mine into a career.
Yeah,
And that's what really led me to doing what I do today. Just really interested in building relationship with people and being able to reciprocally facilitate
yeah,
growth because it's not just about my client, right? By
yeah.
hearing a lot of personal storytelling and sharing, I learned a lot about myself in the process. So
Yeah.
it's been an interesting journey thus far, but at the root of it, just really wanting to connect with people.
Yeah, so you already kind of touched on what my next question would have been, like just being able to the most rewarding part for you is probably just that, you're not only learning from your client and helping them grow, but yourself, you're learning so much more about who you are and, where you how you want to view life and stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have this misconception sometimes that the client is the person who only benefits from the therapeutic environment. And
Yeah.
though that is always my utmost concern, I learn a lot about life, different
Mhm.
experiences, different walks of life that might be very similar to mine or very
Yeah.
different. And I'd say
Mhm.
that's one of the most rewarding. It's been something at the forefront of my career for a long time. But even as we consider what happened in 2020 and how the country was just on a brink of a lot of uncertainty, havoc. Some people might even call it disaster, right?
Mhm.
And I think what's so important in moving beyond the challenges that we've seen is gaining a lot of perspective, right? And
Mhm.
that's something that I really enjoy in my work because sometimes we hear a lot about an experience, but we don't necessarily know until we hear it from that person who had been through it or
Yeah.
the person who experienced a struggle or who is currently experiencing one. And it really gives you this opportunity to connect and empathize and support people in a different way, a more powerful way. And that's something that's always stood out to me in the work that I do.
Yeah, and it's just incredible to me the amount of people that you might meet in life who they seem like the nicest person or they're just like this really upbeat, not you think nothing would have happened to them or they might not be going through anything. And then
Yeah.
you see, oh wow, they went through this and oh my gosh, like they were going through that when I knew them and you're like, "Oh my gosh." And it kind of changes like cuz I would say that a lot of society has a focus on like when people think of depression, for example, they think
Mhm.
of somebody who's just like constantly sad, always in a bad mood. Like you
Yeah.
walk into a store with a hoodie on and you're wearing sunglasses. But then like it's like no, like hundreds of people, probably people that we all know just struggle with it and we can't necessarily, you know, break it down into one thing.
Absolutely. And I think, depression has a lot of manifestations, right? And I
Mhm.
think, like you mentioned, we commonly keep our eyes open for the very strong telltale signs, but also people can function at a very high level and do a very great job at keeping these things away from people who might want to support them the
Mhm.
most for whatever reason, right? And oftentimes people find somewhat comfort in suffering in silence, so
Mhm.
to speak, right? As to
Yeah.
not burden other people or as to not challenge themselves to have a very courageous conversation about what's currently happening in their lives.
Yeah.
But it's incredibly important to know that depression can look a variety of ways, much like any mental health disorder.
Mhm.
And it's so important to be mindful about staying connected to people, right?
Yeah.
I'll always come back to that because in those really strong relationships that we cultivate, we feel when something is off. And if
Yeah.
we don't, we have the comfort to be able to ask those very direct questions
Mhm.
to be able to support someone
Yeah.
or put them in the hands of someone who can provide more adequate support.
Exactly. And just going off of that, like there's a whole movement now for people to be more conscious of their mental health. A lot of people say like destigmatize mental health. And me personally, I don't know how much I agree with a lot of aims of that movement. I feel like it's very easy to say, well, let's destigmatize it, but for people going through it, it's so difficult to feel like what they are dealing with is accepted, or so it leads to a lot of hesitancy. So what might you say to someone struggling with mental illness who might kind of be wary of going to therapy?
Yeah, great question. And just to briefly respond to what you've mentioned,
Mhm.
I really understand and hear and recognize some of your qualms with this idea or focus around destigmatizing, the experience of mental health disorders. But I also believe it's incredibly important for people not experiencing that to be
Yes.
able to destigmatize it,
Mhm.
right? Because
Yeah.
in doing that, we give people who are struggling with really big challenges the opportunity to feel comfortable in their own vulnerability in a
Yes.
social setting with their peers, with their family members, with their friends,
Mhm.
their colleagues, because we work actively as a society to say, this is okay. It is something that we all deal with, and there's solutions that exist, and there's no judgment or criticism around the
Mhm.
struggle that we're having, but more
Yes.
so, be open to the opportunity of sharing so that the greatest support can come into your life. And
Of course.
what I would say to people experiencing something like that is to be very mindful of the people that are closest to you,
Mhm.
the people who share in your life's joys, the people who have been there for you for years, right?
Mhm.
People who really show up within your life. Be mindful of the challenge it's going to take
Yes.
to be able to be open and honest with them,
Mhm.
but also think about the benefit of that vulnerability,
Yes.
right? When we oftentimes I'll compare it to some of my clients is that if we're struggling with something really big, metaphorically, it can seem like in a dark room, it's everything. It's
Yes.
everywhere we look. There's
Mhm.
no way to get out of it. And that might be what that experience feels like.
Yeah.
But that practice of vulnerability can be like opening a door and letting some light in. And we
Mhm.
see what felt like it was cataclysmic and impossible to move beyond.
Yes.
We see when in strong connection and
Mhm.
relationship with other people, we get a little bit closer to feeling joy,
Yes.
even if it's a marginal improvement
Mhm.
on a week to week basis.
Yeah. And with me, the therapy that I went through that got me over my mental illness, I had a therapist based out of Dearborn who was just he was incredible, you know. And what I loved about his style of therapy was he would not tell me it wouldn't be like, hey Mike, what you can do is you can like go for a jog every day and that'll make you feel great. He was like, all right, Michael, the reason you feel this way is because of this. And it was like going to therapy. I think people have a weird perception of what actually happens. You're not going to go in there like therapists are doctors, but they're not what you would necessarily call, like a medical doctor, or the result there. Like if I have a broken arm, for example, I break my arm and I go to the doctor. He says, "Oh, it's healed, it's straight. You can go throw again or whatever I'm doing." With a therapist, I think that people don't realize that it's a lot of legwork on your own part as the patient, and then people will get home, for example, and struggle a lot with depression and anxiety. So, what would be some at-home ways? And I know I'm loading these questions like crazy, but what would be some at-home ways for people to get through, their depression and anxiety or cope with what they're dealing with?
Great question. Great question. And I always have a rather interesting answer to
Mhm.
this, even as some of my clients will ask it of me.
Yeah.
And I think that initially thinking about coping tools is how we've
Mhm.
been somewhat trained to approach mental illness,
Yeah.
right? We want to be able to cope with something that is
Mhm.
incredibly challenging. But in contrast, what I like to focus a little bit more on is discovering more about why the difficulty is there. Much like
Yeah.
it sounds like your therapist
Hmm.
worked with you on, and for each style, it'll look a little bit different.
Yeah.
But what I would say is begin asking some very profound questions to
Hmm.
yourself. What I've learned in my own personal life is that journaling is incredibly beneficial just to give me the opportunity to introspect and learn more about myself and
Yeah.
consistently develop a little bit more self-awareness. So what I would imagine would be really beneficial for people at home is to ask three pretty prominent questions, right?
Hmm.
Here's what are you currently experiencing, objectively defined,
Yes.
without leading into the emotions surrounding it, but just talk about what it is. The
Hmm.
here's what.
Yeah.
So what? Take a look at what are the impacts that you're recognizing because of this thing that you're experiencing,
Hmm.
or this maybe situationally contingent moment that you're a part of.
Yes.
And lastly, ask yourself, now what?
Hmm.
We see what the circumstances are, we recognize how it impacts us. And I like to always benefit and empower my clients towards a strong sense of sustainable agency.
Yes.
So I ask in that creative brainstorming space, right? What would we like to do to move beyond this moment? What would
Hmm.
feel the most comfortable to you? Do you need to be around a support system? Do you need to be alone for a period of time? Do you need to exercise? Do you need to draw? Do you need to journal, paint, read? Anything to be very mindful about that experience of putting you somewhere different, right? And it's not invalidating what you're experiencing, but also creating the space for something else
Yes.
simultaneously. Because we can experience joy and sorrow
Hmm.
within the same moment, right? It's the
Yes.
complexity of human emotion.
Hmm. Yeah, and I really liked what you just touched on with, the support system that you got to surround yourself, or just in general, what you have to surround yourself with when you're dealing with something.
Yeah.
So, how can people around somebody dealing with mental illness help them? Like, what would you say the best avenue for them would be?
Yeah. Good question, rather large one, because
Yeah.
I'll always take a look at the individualized difference
Hmm.
from person to person.
Yes.
But generally speaking, what I would always say is think very empathically about
Hmm.
the situation. And
Yes.
sometimes it can be challenging to do that because we lean into sympathy quite a bit, because that's
Hmm.
what a lot of Western culture, socioculturally teaches us to
Yes.
do. And I often describe the difference as, let's say we're at a funeral.
Hmm.
Sympathy says everything will be okay, which in
Yes.
some circumstances, that could be the farthest thing from the truth.
Hmm.
Whereas empathy says, I'm not sure what to say to you right now, but
Yes.
I know that this is a really challenging moment, and I'm
Hmm.
here beside you throughout it whenever you feel comfortable to speak with me. Because it's touching base onto, how do human beings just naturally go through a really challenging time? And
Hmm.
sometimes it's not as rigid, right?
Yes.
So I would say be very mindful about empathically meeting people where they
Hmm.
are and letting them know that when they feel the most comfortable and ready, you
Yes.
are here ready
Hmm.
to listen and unconditionally meet them with some pretty positive regard.
Yeah. That is like precisely what I did in my own personal experience, and what I've heard from a lot of people is, uh, you just got to cut somebody free for a little bit, and like I said earlier, just help them like help themselves in a way. For
Mm,
me, it was directly telling my cousin, like, look, I'm not going to be in your life. I'm not going to like talk to you. But it's because I care about you.
mm,
And so I think that it's also important for people to recognize when they're putting too much effort in, because I think that that can lead to mental illness for the person that is trying to help them as well.
mm. I would agree that in certain
Yeah.
circumstances, it can pose a lot
Hmm.
of challenge for people
Yeah.
when we attempt to support and we don't see a lot of
Hmm.
benefit from the intervention that we feel is the most beneficial.
Yeah.
And in circumstances like that, I would also be mindful of how empathic and compassionate we're being to ourselves, right?
Yes.
And maybe taking on a burden or a task that you're not well equipped for isn't
Hmm.
a recognition of a weakness or a character flaw,
Yes.
but it might be of benefit to say, I'm not sure if I would be able to, to be of the greatest support, but I do know really great people that you could speak with. And
Yes.
even in that small conversation like that, it gives us the opportunity to touch base on something you mentioned earlier around
Mhm.
destigmatizing the
Exactly.
practice of going and speaking with the
Yes.
therapist. And sometimes a big piece of that is hearing
Mhm.
from your best friend or your
Yeah.
brother or your sister or your
Mhm.
partner that, hey, it might be a really great idea for you to take advantage of this
Yeah.
opportunity to speak with someone who could
Mhm.
provide a pathway for you to
Yeah.
experience some real change.
Mhm. And kind of just a last question would be, what advice would you have for somebody, in a difficult family situation currently?
In a difficult family situation, I would say first and foremost, be mindful of family that exists outside of your biological family,
Mhm.
right? I'm a very strong believer and proponent for being able to choose a family. And by
Mhm.
that, I mean surrounding yourself with unconditional love that you are in the deciding seat to say, this
Mhm.
is someone who I want to reciprocally share in my life with. So be very mindful about constructing that space of safety outside of the home if you find that it doesn't exist there. And always, always be mindful about reaching out to a clinician who could provide support individually or interventions for the family as a whole in order to give them the tools they need to consistently move forward in a different direction.
That is seriously perfect. It was honestly a big pleasure speaking with you. You've been the best person I've talked to so far. It's been great. It really has.